Welcome everybody to our Talking with Syeyutsus. We are pleased that you're all here to join us. We think we have some terrific guests to talk with you today and guide us through what things look like with the Indian Act and how it impacts all of us as Canadian citizens. My name is Ted Cadwallader. I'm originally from Tsachis, Fort Rupert on the north end of the island in the territory of the Cadwallader. I'm talking to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Nanaimo people on the west coast on Vancouver Island. And I'm behind the scenes here is our Syeyutsus, the person who does the work for us around Syeyutsus, Stephanie Johnson, and our friend Karen McDonald. She's monitoring the chat, and we'll surface some of your questions as things turn up. I want to, again, welcome you all to this session, and following protocol, I'm going to ask our relative Tzomquatan, Lawrence Mitchell, to welcome you all to this territory and start this off in a very good way. So, Lawrence.
Huych'qa Siem Huych'qa Siem Amistau Aquatha Exqualman Dichum Tlachant the Stalikith Dichum Latlamethod Septa Sarchanst Tiwiatsan Quaswa Kikalisi Kaki Mistimoch Dichum Slachanstoch Donaswalmoch Huych'qa at the Heil Eight Squale Natwash Quamquams Donasalist a Tanaquali to Maxwell Huych'qa. Whoa, oh, 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 oh.
Huych'qa Siem Samtquatin. We are very fortunate today. We have a relative, Koktsumalagalis, joining us, Bob Joseph, well-respected relative and author of the book many of you have read and are trying to bring into your own life and help you walk this path of reconciliation and success. So, Gela Kashla, Koktsumalagalis, you have the floor.
All right. Thank you very much, and thanks, Lawrence, for the song and sharing the nice, kind words. And thanks to the organizers for bringing me in. It's really my honor and my privilege to be here today to share with you what I know about the Indian Act, and so I'm looking forward to our time together. And I'll be watching the chat to see what kinds of great questions come in. This is part of work that I've done now for a number of years. Since about 1994, I started working for a company called BC Hydro, and I was doing Aboriginal awareness training. And it was only for hydro people. It was kind of a neat process that way. But what I realized in those presentations was that the average Canadian just didn't know a lot about the history, especially the Indian Act. And so I began to learn a lot about it as well, and I would get lots of good, tough questions about the Indian Act or about Indigenous issues and how they sort of all fit together. And so it's been a really neat learning journey going back to the mid-1990s. What I realized was that the Indian Act was such a central figure, and it didn't, at times the Indian Act applied to other peoples too, those troublesome lawyers who might want to pursue land claim activity on behalf of the different nations, whether they're Métis or Inuit or First Nations. And certainly when we look back to the apology by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, we saw the First Nations, the Métis and Inuit were all present for the formal apology and sort of the lead into the TRC and sort of the reconciliation process as we see it today. So the Indian Act has been sort of at the heart of that conversation. And it's been at the heart of it, not because it doesn't apply to everybody, but because of the ideology that it really presented. It was really an assimilation policy. That's what it was designed to do. It was designed to assimilate people into the political and economic mainstream. So that's sort of where I'll be coming from. And I hope it's okay. I brought a presentation. Would it be all right if I didn't really talk to Ted? Is that all right? Can I pull up a presentation, or is it? All right, let me just pull this up and I will go present. I got not that one. Let's see, there we go, 21 things. Escape.
Okay.
Now, do I have to hit share screen there, Ted, or what's
Yes.
I should know this part, actually. I've done a lot of chat meetings lately.
Okay.
So I promise I won't keep it too long, and I'm just going to hit share on the presentation I'm looking for. Okay, got that.
That works great.
One more. Here we go. We're getting warmer. And then presenter view. There we go. And I can share a copy of these slides with you as well for distribution at a later time. So, you know, the presentation we put through, it's been part of the book, which is doing incredibly well. And really, we're just so happy that people are willing to learn about history and culture and all of those kind of things. Given the stuff that's happening in the US with Mr. Floyd and all of that whole conversation, Chapters and Indigo actually added it to its list of books that, you know, if you're looking for things on racism and looking for different perspective, ours was lumped into that whole group by some very big booksellers that way. So 21 things you may not know about the Indian Act, just some of the quotes that we went through to try and get a sense of where we are and where we're going, and we'll certainly talk about that. But when the past doesn't recognize the wrongs of the future takes its revenge. For that reason, we must never turn away from the opportunity of confronting history together and the opportunity to right a historical wrong. And I think that's really where we are as a country today, when we start looking at all of the issues that come out of that policy. Duncan Campbell Scott has readily acknowledged that the Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habitating so closely in the residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate in their villages. But this does not justify a change in the policy of the department, which is geared towards a final solution. So I've been watching a lot of shows on Netflix lately. Certainly some of the stuff there that's on, the Nazi Party and stuff. And I always thought the final solution was really attributed to that. So I was surprised to see way back in 1910, they were talking about a final solution to the Indian problem as it's described by Duncan Campbell Scott. John A. said we want to wean them by slow degrees from their nomadic habits, which have almost become an instinct, and by slow degrees absorb them or settle them on the land. Meantime, they must be fairly protected. So when we talk about the Indian Act, it's really important to understand that when we set it up in 1867, we put into place the British North America Act, this section called 9124. And underneath 9124, we give control over Indians and lands reserved for Indians to the federal government. They become a federal responsibility at that time. And the relationship that is set up is actually a trustee wardship relationship, that Indians and bands and their members would all become wards of the crown, and that the federal government, the Department of Indian Affairs, would become the trustee. And that's what he says when we're saying, meantime, they must be fairly protected. So Canada actually has a fiduciary duty to look after Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And it's unstated here, but what we should state is until they assimilate, because that's what we're going to try and do with the Indian Act, is assimilate them. John A. also said it is worthy of consideration whether legislative measures should not be adopted for the establishment of some kind of municipal system among such bands as are found sufficiently advanced to justify the experiment being tried. It is hoped that a system may be adopted which will give the effect of accustoming the Indians to the modes of government prevalent in the white communities surrounding them, and that it will thus tend to prepare them for early amalgamation with the general population of the country. So by the time we become a country, the stage is set for this post-Confederation assimilation policy. Canada really, at that time, viewed Indians and Métis peoples and Inuit peoples as dying races of people. They felt that they just, eventually they were going to die out. And so we take a look at, we're in a really interesting time now with COVID-19. There was definitely a lot of problems with disease that they didn't have immunity to, smallpox and influenza and things that maybe the rest of the population had a lot of immunity to. They didn't have any. And so when I think about Sakis and Fort Victoria and places like that, where we did see forts, in 1846, and I can't remember the order, but there was two epidemics, smallpox and influenza. In 1846, the first one comes through and takes over 90% of the population. They just didn't have immunity. They were just dying. And literally in that really super short time, over 90% of the population's wiped out. If you're left with 10%. And then 2 years later, the next one comes through and takes another over 90% of the population. So what we were seeing in the time of the beginning of the Indian Act was this, what Canada viewed as a dying race of people that would eventually assimilate and become part of the rest of the population. And so just trying to prepare them for that amalgamation, that was sort of the basis. They weren't fitting in as much as military alliances as they were in the past. And so Canada, really saw those two things and said, well, dying race of people, the best thing that can happen for them is they assimilate, they become like everybody else. So let's just start doing that. And so the Indian Act, this is the foundation of the Indian Act, the basis of which, and we're going to be able to move forward from that. So if we step back a little bit in broad Canadian history, just to give you a little bit of a historical perspective, in the beginning, we would have saw Indian policy being portrayed differently. We would have saw way back in 1763, the Royal Proclamation really set the stage for a nation-to-nation relationships. And he actually uses those words, that it's just and reasonable and essential to our interests that the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and to live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as not having been ceded to or purchased by us or reserved to them or any of them as their hunting grounds. So the Royal Proclamation, that first era of history, really is a nation-to-nation basis. So as the colonial government was expanding westward with the fur trade, the gold rush, agricultural expansion, the coming of the railroad, all of those things driving us west, underneath this proclamation, we were negotiating treaties with nations or tribes. We were purchasing land from them. We were setting out fishing and hunting provisions. And we did that because after the Battle of Quebec, King George had realized that those nations, as he referred to them, really would be valuable in his gaining control of what is now Canada. They held the balance of power between competing colonial governments. So in the Battle of Quebec, 1759, you got the British and the French, they're squared off on the Plains of Abraham. They're quite evenly matched. And over on the sidelines, if you will, were the First Nations, and they were literally picking and choosing who they should fight with. And so in that conflict, they came up with the notion that they would side mostly with the British. And it was a break from what they'd done previously. And that little shift in their position was enough to give King George the opportunity to prevail on the Plains of Abraham. So he comes away from the Battle of Quebec with this insight that Indigenous peoples would hold the balance of power in any military campaigns that were going to be fought, but they would also hold the balance of power in any trade relationships. They were the ones harvesting the furs. They could pick and choose which fort to sell their furs to. And so we look at the Northwest coast, you had Spanish traders, Russian traders, you had certainly British traders as well. So there was a lot of jockeying for control over the West Coast. And so that Royal Proclamation set out this nation-to-nation relationship. He actually recognizes them, those nations or tribes, those owning the lands that they use and occupy. He says it needs to be ceded to or purchased by us. And that sets the stage for treaty making. And in the context of the proclamation, very nation-to-nation, but by confederation, we decide that, we can't do that anymore. They're a dying race of people. They're not fitting in militarily. We should start to assimilate them. So we set out this relationship where they become wards of the crown. We're going to forcibly culturally assimilate them. And the Indian Act would give Canada the coordinated approach to this new policy of assimilation. Where we are today, much different. In fact, if you came here to find out if the country is still trying to assimilate, you'll be a little bit disappointed, because way back in 1982, the federal government sort of restored the nation-to-nation relationship. And there's a section of the Constitution Act called Section 35. And in Section 35, the federal government in the Constitution Act said, we're going to recognize and affirm the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. So just that one statement marked the death of the forced cultural assimilation policy. We're not going to take away their rights anymore, which is what the Indian Act is largely viewed at, as a rights taker or awayer, if I can use that expression. The Constitution Act now said we're going to recognize and affirm, and so that's really the three main eras of history. So when I start talking about the Indian Act, and I'm going to go through it really quickly so we do have time for questions and comments, I just want you to keep that in mind. Some of the questions I can answer differently. Bob, do just Indians have to live on reserve? You know what? In the heyday of assimilation, those are the only people that could live on reserve. Today, because we've abandoned forced cultural assimilation, we're recognizing, affirming. You look at groups like West Bank First Nation, there's over 10,000 non-First Nations people living on their land, paying taxes to the nation. And so we've abandoned the forced cultural assimilation. So that one question I can answer differently depending on the era. I can give you the Indian Act answer, I can give you the answer today, or even look back into the third era. But some of the things that it did, it imposed the elected chief and council system. It said, you know what, Ted, the way you're governing yourselves, that's a backward society. We got to get you out of that big house, and you need to become familiar with the form of government we're all using. And so one of the direct impositions on the part of the Indian Act was to do away with the traditional government, the hereditary chiefs, in the case of Vancouver Island, traditional leaders all around the Americas, and required them to elect a chief and council. To have a chief and council, you're allowed a chief and council member for every 100 people. If you've got 201 people, you've got one elected chief and one council member. That was just it. They're elected by their people, but they're accountable to Indian affairs. That's how the system works. And unless you've got some kind of self-government agreement, that's what's in place for many of the bands across the country. It denied women status, so women who married non-Indian men lost their status. And other women who were not Indigenous at all, if they married somebody like myself before 1985, I'm a status Indian, they could gain their status. And so it was a very discriminatory piece of legislation, but Canada felt that, this intermarriage piece could take us a long way down the road to assimilation. It created the reserve systems. Reserves, that's what they're called in Canada. They're not reservations. In the United States, a reservation is much different than a reserve. And so in Canada, they're reserves. And there's an important distinction here. It's not title land. It's not ownership land. It is reserved. Simply, when we look at it in the context of the Indian Act, a reserve is a place where people are going to go until they assimilate. And once they do, those federal parcels of Crown land could then be sold or disposed of, or whatever the federal government wanted to do about that. So they're called reserves, and it encouraged voluntary and enforced enfranchisement. So we were trying to get the names off the list. That's what the Indian Act was designed to do. It was actually, the whole status and non-status thing was like a key performance indicator for, well, how do we know when they've assimilated? Well, we're going to legally, racially define them. We're going to show up at SACIs. We're going to put down everybody's name on a list. And then we're going to look for ways to unlegally racially define them. We're going to make them status Indians, and we're going to move them over to the non-status. Once they're all non-status, they're all considered assimilated. And so that's basically what assimilation was going to be designed to do. By the way, if you're wondering what a band is a body of Indians. And so we wanted, just to let people know that it's just that listing of names. And if you were there in the community that day, your name went on a list. And if you weren't, you didn't. It was just, maybe you ended up on another list, or you didn't get enfranchised at all. And maybe that's where we start to see a little bit of the birth of the Métis Nation, some of that confusion early in the in the Confederation era. We've been pampering and coaxing the Indians that we must take a new course. We must indicate the position of the white man. We must teach the Indians what law is, and we must not pauperize them, as what they say we have been doing. We could expropriate portions of reserve for public works. We could rename individuals. So the Indian agent would literally show up at SACIs, and they'd say to Ted, name? And Ted would say, in my case, I would say, Malagalese. And they would say, okay, Bob, Joseph, it is. They literally change your name right on the spot. So I actually always get asked, are you related to the Josephs at Squamish? And what about the Josephs at the Gitxsan? And I know there's Josephs in Alberta too. And so people are always asking me, are you related to those Josephs? And I always say, no, I'm not, but I'm pretty sure we had the same Indian agent. So a little bit of Indian affairs humor for you, just in terms of the whole naming policy thing. And in some cases, they would use colors. So you've got the browns, you've got the greens, you've got the whites, and it was some really interesting naming policies. They created a permit system. So one of the reasons that they don't do well in the economy today is that they really weren't a part of it. We didn't allow them to sell stuff off of the reserve. We prohibited the sale of ammunition. So at some point we started to be paranoid that they weren't our military allies. We prohibited the sale of intoxicants. So we didn't want problems with addictions creeping into the conversation. We declared the potlatch and sundance and powwows and spirit dancing, and all of that stuff becomes illegal. You're not allowed to practice your ceremonies. We restricted them to leaving their reserve without permission. You actually had to get permission. If you left for more than 30 days at a time without written permission, you could be automatically enfranchised. We created residential schools, so reconciliation really comes out of the whole residential school challenge. We forbade them from appearing in public dance or exposition or stampede or pageant wearing traditional regalia. We didn't want them forming political organizations. You couldn't meet in groups of 3 or more without official written permission. And even then, it had to be for religious purposes. It couldn't be for political purposes. So that was a big challenge. It prohibited anyone from soliciting funds to hire legal counsel. We didn't want them in pool halls. And that, it's funny, this one comes up all the time, Ted. Why did they do this one? And I always tell people, because I'm really good at snooker and you don't want to play me. That's my sort of thoughts on that. Forbade students from participating in their traditional religion. That's why I think, Lawrence, your song was so important at the start of this session. It took a lot of time, probably for non-Indigenous peoples, especially project managers, or they'd be like, why are we having to do this? And it's because we took away all of this. And so when you're working with Indigenous peoples today, they're trying to stop the loss and grow the culture because they've just come out of an experience where Canada tried to take it away. And so that's why songs and prayers and acknowledgements and all of those things are really important in relationship building. Denied the right to vote up until 1960 because an Indian was anybody other than a person, and is a piece of legislation created under colonial rule for the purpose of subjugating a group of people. So there you go, just a quick overview of the 21 things, some of the background that goes into it. Now, certainly I'd love to hear some questions if I could.
Bob, thanks so much for that and going through it. And I know it's a quick skim. For some of us, there's a lot of personal pieces in there that we relate to and have been impacted by. And even the folks who have joined us who are not Holmoch or Apachom, they too, without their knowledge, have been impacted by this piece of legislation their whole life. Not so bluntly as some of our relatives, but certainly have been impacted. And so that's part of this walk that we're on. So I'm going to turn it to Karen and Stephanie to pick out some questions if they can pose them to you.
Perfect.
Yes, thank you, Ted and Bob. There are a couple questions. Are chief and council still responsible today to INAC?
Yes, they are.
Affairs?
Yeah, they are. And it's a great question. They're responsible. But remember, when we created these chief and councils, their responsibility was to be for reserve land things, for healthcare, housing, education. That was really the purpose. They certainly, in the view of what was going on with the Wet'suwet'en and the Coastal GasLink project, they certainly wouldn't be responsible for making decisions about the broader territory. That would fall to the collective or to the hereditary chiefs or to other traditional leaders, because not everybody had hereditary chiefs. And so that was, when we take a look at Coastal GasLink, that's what the Gitxsan hereditary chiefs were saying. Hey, these are our territories. When I look in, Ted, you can back me up on this one, but there were chiefs and Sakis that owned whole mountain ranges and whole river watersheds that they actually owned it and traded and sold and acquired and potlatches and that kind of stuff. And so they would view that as their responsibility, and that healthcare, housing, and education, that's where the elected chief and councils were supposed to come into. So remember, Canada felt that they were going to assimilate, and eventually when they assimilated, there'd be no more land claims, no more self-government. We wouldn't have to consult them for building pipelines. Once they'd assimilated, all of these problems would disappear. The ones that we're wrestling with today in Canada would disappear. And the problem is they haven't disappeared, and these very fundamental questions about governance are still there and still need to be answered. And if you talk to the hereditary chiefs, they'll say, look, you know, nobody grants us government. We have an inherent right to government. It's self-government. It comes from the creator. It's not given to us by a British colonial government or a Canadian government. It's something that we've always had as a people. And where the Indian Act was, you know, we're gonna make them do this, and you know, we'll tie it to funding for healthcare, housing, and education. And so those are the kinds of things that we're wrestling with around the Ben, Chief, and Council system.
Yes, thanks, Bob. We actually had a potlatch to put a chief in position last fall that has rights to inlets and mountain ranges and all the resources therein. So that still goes on, certainly, and it happened in the big house that you can see behind me in my screen.
Maybe we have one more question for you, Bob. And this is timely because we're going to be discussing this in the panel, is what is the role of hereditary chiefs now in Indigenous communities?
Wow, that's such a great question. And you know what? I think after this coastal gas link, and the federal government and provincial government has just done something with traditional leaders or hereditary chiefs in the case of the Wet'suwet'en, I think we're going to see that become a much more prominent feature. That was just such a costly exercise, you know, with the port blockades and the railway blockades, that, you know, there's no way that it costs just $6 billion to build that pipeline. There's so many more costs with that. And I think that whole conversation has created a pivot point in Canadian history. And what we're going to see is a real appetite there for the Crown, the federal and provincial governments to sort this out. And I think it gives all of the 600 different nations across the country the opportunity to have a very fundamental conversation. Do we support our hereditary chiefs, or do we want this Ben, Chief, and Council system? And so I think the door is really open by what has happened, and with the Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chiefs Agreement, I think we see a government there that's interested. I think it's, to me, it just represents the suffering as optional approach. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. And I think if we acknowledge, we give the opportunity to those communities to decide how they want to be governed. And it, you know, in the case of Nisga'a, in their treaty, they blended the two systems together. So they had, you know, they have a LISMS government, which has an elected sort of president and sort of governing body. They have village governments. They said that, you know, when it came to self-determination, nobody in Ottawa gets to tell us who our people are. They said, if you can show descendancy to a Nisga'a matriarch, then you're eligible to participate in the activities of the Nisga'a Nation. So it deals with what I call the three selves: self-determination, self-government. They decided what the government would look like and how it would work. Some of it elected, some of it traditional. And the real goal, and what Indigenous peoples are after, and I think that, you know, the Nisga'a probably expressed it really well, was that the self-reliance piece. We want to participate in the political and economic mainstream, but in a way that protects our culture. That's really, people say, Bob, just tell me what they want. If I know what they want, I can decide whether I get on this or not. And I'll say they want three things. They want self-government, they want self-determination. Nobody in Ottawa gets to tell them who their people are, and self-reliance. And it's that control and ownership of resources and resource revenue sharing and getting into the space of tax and all of that stuff. I think that's you know, Nisga'a gives us an example of all of the common elements and how each nation will have to pick and choose to try to decide what will work best for their people. In the case of Nisga'a, they actually waived the tax exemption. Yep, we'll pay taxes. If we sign this treaty, we'll pay taxes. And there was some rumbling there from those Nisga'a Nation members. And I think taxpayers in any culture are the same. We don't want to pay more taxes. But when I looked at sort of the rationale for the Nisga'a Nation to pay taxes, they said, you know what, there's more net benefit to our people if our people are paying taxes than if they aren't paying taxes. When we look back at the time of the ratification of the Nisga'a Treaty, Indian Affairs was providing $5,500 per year per child for K through 12 education funding to the Nisga'a. And they couldn't go all the way K through 12, they could only go K through 7. Where right down the road in Prince Rupert, those children were getting $8,500 per year per child. So I know Ted's big on parity and the Walk Together group's big on parity. And I could see what the Nisga'a were thinking. There's more net benefit if our people are paying taxes than if they aren't paying taxes. If we can get that funding, that's taxpayer equity funding, they called it. That's a reason we should get rid of the tax exemption. And the other reason they wanted to get rid of the tax exemption is they actually want into the space of tax. They're going to be a taxing nation. They're going to collect, lands and resources fees, stumpage fees, which they already are, and mining royalties, and all kinds of other things. And so, a neat thing to look at. It's not the panacea, it's not the silver bullet. But if you want to see what the future could look like, it's not a bad future. And I remember there was lots of predictions. We can't do this. The world's going to cave in, and but what really have you heard about Nisga'a? And if your answer is I haven't heard a lot about it, what that says is it's working. And if you want a stable investment in climate and all of that other stuff, it's working there. So I just would appeal to tax-paying Canadians that way. So thank you. Sorry for such a long-winded answer to you.
It's a long path that we're on, Bob. Thank you very much. I know there's a lot more questions on there, and for those questions that we can't get to, I really encourage our participants to search out Bob Joseph online. There's blogs, there's newsletters, there's all sorts of answers to your questions too. So, Gaila Kasla, Kokso Malagalis, it was wonderful to have you here with us. Please stay. We're going to move into our next sections too, and it was a nice transition on those about the hereditary chiefs, because we have two of our panel members here who have been participants in the elected chief and council system, and also are both immersed in and traveling that journey around language and culture in Syeyutsus First Nation and Nanaimo First Nation. So in our next segment here, on Talking with Syeyutsus, we're going to be joined by George Seymour and Lawrence Mitchell, Tsumkwatan and Scott from their nations together. So to start us off, maybe Scott, you could talk a little bit about your adventures, I'll say, in elected chief and council world, and also what hereditary governance might look like within your nation today. And the floor is over to the two of you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Bob for everything that he mentioned. He read, kind of gets me all upset. Well, when you think about the Indian Act, but yes, my traditional name, Scott Saywell, it comes from my father, who handed down to me at his deathbed. And that's the same way he was handed down his name. And who was the hereditary, I don't know if we call it headman or chief or whatever you call it in the Syeyutsus territories, but yes, I never thought I'd be in this role, but everything my father said to me at his deathbed kind of hooked me into this, and I've always been active. I run for council, I run for leader. I was actually chief in 1988, and it's a tough go. You can't make everybody happy, but I really support the Wet'suwet'en. I was supporting the Wet'suwet'en hereditary leaders of what they actually did. And I know that we could be working together with the elected leaders. I think we cannot forget our traditional leaders. our Huych'qa, they call. We can't forget them because otherwise we wouldn't be here. Maybe we would be totally assimilated. So I'm running for the chiefs or the leaders seat again because of the COVID-19. It was postponed. So whenever that happens, I'm hoping to make changes and make the young people realize that where we come from and where we should go. If we're walking together, we can't be split, but we need to respect our grandparents of what they tried to do in helping our people survive in this land. Even though like I'm very traditional. I hunt, I fish, I prepare my own food and everything. But I'm very interested in what's happening with the traditional government, with treaty. You know, when I read about the different treaties that are happening, some I support, some I don't support. But it's a journey. Like, I want to be involved. I hoping to get the young people, our future, involved because of not too much change. Not too many of the young people actually vote, so come out to vote and election time. So so after this COVID-19, these new days that we're facing, I'm hoping to capture that seat again. I actually jumped in with 2 feet. People wanted change in 1988. I jumped on 2 feet and I held the 1 term. And now I feel I could jump in with 2 feet again and feel more confident in leading people and working together with more if it's elected council and reintroduce the traditional ways, because there are still a few people that we have a few elders that still remember. We have a handful of speakers. I'm very also interested in my language, and last year, June 13th, I received my paper in linguistics, Halkamino linguistics. I could be teaching the language a long time ago because I could speak it, but I didn't feel confident because I couldn't read or write the language. But now I can, and because I have my master's. But my goal is to capture the leaders, the head man, or whatever we want to call it, chief, and make the people understand what's happening today, what happened yesterday, and lead them into the future.
Thank you.
So if there's any questions.
I'm going to turn to Tom Coughlin too. You've also been on this path, Lawrence, of being on council and working in an elected role. Can you talk a little bit about how you manage to stay on this strong cultural path that you're on and operate in that elected chief and council system? And do the two ever smash into each other, or can you meld them at most times?
Huych'qa nanutsi atala makshwet ikwanasi nala and samkwatan. I'm really thankful to be here among some beautiful people and sharing some strong wisdom to help forge a stronger relationship and change the future for those unborn. I grew up in foster care pretty much my whole young life, and I didn't really understand what it meant to be cultural. It took me about 25 to 30 years to even begin to understand who we are as Ko Salish Kwalmo. And that happened, I think, because of the people who voted me in on Chief and Council. And I wanted to be able to represent our people in all of the highest levels of government with municipalities and regional and national professionals and experts. And in the very beginning, I tell about a story. We have a community map. And I was like, oh my God, I know what I'm going to do, and I'm going to put it in the newsletter. So what I done was I drew the map of all the different houses in our community, and they were teepees. And I'm like, oh my God, the people are going to love this. And I'm so happy that it didn't go out because that really spoke to my awareness and my knowledge of who we are as in the Ko Salish, stout, our big house people. Only just recently, within the last several years, I've begun to fully immerse myself into as much of the culture and the language as I can. Thinking about my tenure in governance, elected Indian Act governance, I really found myself battling with what was going on in here versus what I knew I had to do and my responsibility to the Crown, because I was enforcing policy upon my own people and making decisions that were paternalistic. And it was very hard and it was very difficult for me sometimes. And I had, there were times when I went home crying because I thought I was doing something wrong. Mm-hmm. And I thought that, I didn't know what I was doing. Why did I put my name in the hat? Well, one thing that I'm really thankful for is the help that I received from within the culture, from the sacred lands that we are a part of, and the ancestors lifting me up and sharing with me the strength that I needed to get through those 13 years that I just was in governance. It's only been a few months since I've been off council. And I'm still shaking off those effects because you have to make decisions that go against your traditional ways. And that's very hard. It's very difficult to tell your father or your auntie or your uncle or your brother or your children that they're not allowed to do something that we've been doing since the beginning of time. And I guess the best way to put it is I relied on the culture for my sali, my spiritual survival. I prayed for that guidance and I prayed for that wisdom, and I was gifted song and I was gifted teachings and I was gifted true history, the Syeyutsus of our people, and that's what kept me going throughout those 13 years. So it does balance here and there, but for the most part it's really lopsided. Like there's no room for as much culture as you would like. I hopped into leadership thinking like, hey, I'm going to change. I can help this community. We're going to be real cultural. We're going to learn the language. I was, real young and vibrant and green, and then realizing you get sucked into a machine that doesn't care about this, doesn't care about your spirit and your emotions and your feelings. And it's really changed me a lot and let me know the other side of the fence. And I kind of don't want to go back to that side of the fence anymore, knowing what I know. I'm grateful to be where I'm at, learning the language and learning the culture and meeting like-minded individuals and becoming more of who I'm meant to be by Huych'qa Siem. So I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Oh, I saw a lot of nodding heads, and I'm pretty sure that if we had all of our participants up there. We would see nodding heads there as well. That I think you described that beautifully. Thank you. I'm going to jump back to Bob on this one too, because I know, Bob, you have a traditional name, and you come from a larger nation that has hereditary governance systems and Indian affairs systems operating side by side. And so can you talk a little bit about how those two systems balance each other, or sometimes not?
Yeah, thank you for that. And Lawrence, I really appreciated the, you talked about balance, and the question was about how do you look after people and different governance systems. So I took the liberty of just quickly Google searching a Syeyutsus, which is something that we see around our territory, and we see the very human face in the center, and then the serpent heads represent right and wrong, good and evil. There's sort of a yin and yang, if you will. And so as you're describing it, when the first question first came out, I thought, oh, this is a Syeyutsus question, because you're always going to be stretched that way, right? And it was my dad that sort of taught me that just when you're going through that in your life, if you always keep the Syeyutsus with you, it's your protector. For us, it's like a protector. It's like a Saint Christopher, but it always reminds you of that human face in the middle, that whatever we do, it's always got to be for the people. And so very much a cultural sort of icon for the Kwakwaka'wakw. And so, yeah, I just wanted to share that. In terms of the hereditary and elected chiefs, and I see there's some other questions around it, I really do see a strong role. I remember I was doing some work with a community up north, and I was in the Tsimshian Tribal Council office, and we invited a hereditary chief after lunch to come and make presentations like we've had here this morning. And the hereditary chief had brought a lady with him, and she was sitting there sipping a tea, we'd gone through this sort of conversation earlier on, and the hereditary chief came up, gave a little conversation about how they owned the territory and how it was divided up into houses or teepees, and it was a really great thing. And then we opened it up to questions, and somebody was asking, the relationship between hereditary chiefs and band chiefs, because by now the participants understood that there was a difference and what it was, and so that's the first question. So you're a hereditary chief, and the person said yes, and they said, so how do you get along with the band chief? Let's say I wanted to cut down trees in your territory. How do you get along with the band chief? Like, do they know what you've been telling us, that they're responsible for territories? And the hereditary chief said, yeah, they know. And if they don't listen to us, we make sure they're not here in the next election. Because there was only one elected chief council, and there were 9 hereditary chiefs, right, of this community that he was talking about. So I was just like, whoa, hardcore, man. These hereditary guys representing their families and their clans. And then the next question was even more priceless. The chief was asked by a participant, so how do you know how to become a hereditary chief? Like sort of what Lawrence was talking about in the struggle between band chief and hereditary. How do you even know how to do that? Like, I can go to Harvard, I can go to some business school, or and I can learn how to be a leader, but how do you learn? And it was super cool. The next part of this answer just blew everybody away. He said, oh, good question. He said, before I answer, hey, Auntie, can you come up here, please? And Auntie had been sitting over by the coffee table, drinking tea. She had this nice pastel-y, flowersy sweater and dress, and she wasn't even part of a main table conversation. Put her tea down, stood up, came and walked up, stood behind him off his right shoulder, and he just very politely said, anyways, this is my auntie. 12 years ago in a feast, she gave me my chieftainship and my traditional name, made me responsible for our portion of the territory, and has taught me largely how to do that. And when I'm really stuck, I go to auntie. And I was like, wow, talk about layers now, right? We're out of band chief and council. We're into hereditary chiefs, 9 of them. And, you know, push really comes to shove, we've got to go talk to Auntie. And I was like, this is like so cool, right? You know, so if I was advising a school district on working with that community, I'd say, so, you know, the elected chief's probably going to do healthcare, housing, and education, but the hereditary chiefs, they're still going to have some say here, and they're going to want to hear that you're doing stuff. So you need to develop relationships with them too. And if you really want to get it done, you got to go make sure Auntie's happy. Somebody's got to go every time at the meeting and sit with her and offer her tea and coffee. Make sure she knows you, because if it comes to, you know, we're at loggerheads on something, Auntie's a deal breaker. So that can show you just the complexity. That's just one community. And then one of the other communities, one of my good friends, Keith Matthew from Sink First Nation, giving me a tour of his community. I'm a hereditary chief. Ted knows I'm biased. That's how I look at the world. And I go to this community, and he's introducing me to all these people. And I said to him just very politely when nobody was listening, I said, Keith, where's all your hereditary chiefs? You haven't introduced me to one of your hereditary chiefs. And he said, oh, Bobby, we'd lost that in the assimilation process. Assimilation, you know, like residential schools and banning of the potlatches and all of our ceremonies, we lost that. So we actually do use this band governance system. And so it helped me understand that, you know, there's 7 major language families broken up into over 30 different dialects, represented by 206 bands and 31 tribal councils. What, you know, just for the 131 participants here, they're really diverse. And it would be hard to, I like George's comments. I like what some of them are doing, but I don't like what others are doing. That's such a natural process when you look at such different cultural diversity. Everybody's going to want their own thing that fits with their cultural, you know, values. And back to that, really, what do they want, Bob? Just tell me what they want. I don't know, you know. And for School District 68 and Walking Together, you have to go find out. You got to talk to Ron and the First Nations to see what they want, because they don't all want the same things. And that's okay. That's not a bad thing, but you just have to understand it's one of the dynamics of working with Indigenous peoples, is that they don't all want the same thing, and it's up to us to work with them to find out what would suit them best. And yeah, so thank you, Ted.
Yeah, so we've also been quite blessed, and I could see one of our aunties nodding her head here too. So, and as we continue down this talking with Syeyutsus, I'd like to take us to the next section around education, where we have been guided by aunties and some uncles at the table too, Ron. So I'd like to introduce our participants here to Syeyutsus, Geraldine Manson, who's joined us today, and our superintendent, Scott Saywell. And our question is posed to you both, but I'll start with Auntie. You've been such a central figure in our education system here, and I know that you have that strong cultural underpinning too of who you are, and have guided both our university and our district and our individuals along our path in education too. So could you talk a little bit about that path, education under the Indian Act, and also the education today that you influence so well?
Huych'qa, I first have to recognize and acknowledge the old people, the Solelos. It is they who cleared the path as who I am, and embraced the knowledge. Over the years, many years ago, I had a group of elders who embraced me and guided me for many years, and taught me the importance of education and to walk in 2 worlds. The importance of history, the importance of the meaning of education. What is education? And how do we weave it in the Quinitum world, in the Chomos world? Auntie Ellen Kolosowit had that voice and understanding of what it meant. She too was an elder in resident at BIU, where I am now. It was her that cleared the path for me to be there today. And through her, I became more in understanding how education needed to be brought forward in a different sense, not through the material books, textbooks and everything like that, but hands-on. When we were young and brought into the school system, it was through books. And that didn't work. When I hear George and Lawrence talk and Bob talk about their role in where they are, I too can relate to governance, as I walked as a counselor for my community for 12 years. But that role was guided by the old people, you know, to be remembering what it meant to walk as a counselor in the community, what governance meant to the nation, families, and the importance of education. How was I to knock on the doors to ensure that children are being represented in the schools? Their voice was heard. And I always go back through the eyes of a child. Are they being seen? Are they being heard? I take a step back even further, the residential school era, the 60s school era. And because I was one of those two eras, I can relate to some of the struggles some of the students are still having today in those positions, whether it's elementary, whether it's secondary, or whether it's in a university setting. And how we have to embrace and begin bringing new tools out to these elementary schools, to the secondary schools, to the universities. And what tools do we bring? So the teachers, the instructors could use these tools to work with the students and these different capacities around education. At the university, we bring language into it. I am now just completing a map of the traditional territory of the Nanaimo people, where it would be an audio map, where you can touch screen and hear the voice of the two elders that we chose to be part of this touchscreen map. And hear a booklet that'll go with it, telling the history of all the names and where it came from. This is the era, the future of language, of speaking it. We have booklets, we have CDs that we use on a daily basis in teaching. My brother-in-law, Seymour, who is well-versed and self-taught, but also through the mentorship of elders that walked with him through language and the importance of history that goes with that language. Because language is an everyday tool within the home, within the surrounding. When I hear George talk about the importance of fishing, of hunting, and training the younger people, you want to be a hunter. This is the role that you're going to play to become that hunter or the fisherman. To be able to hear stories. I did a project many years ago where I interviewed elders within the community, and they talked about the importance of hunting, fishing, medicinal medicines, sports, to become active in those roles as an Indigenous person. This is what you must remember mindfully in the back of your mind, to be guided within the home. Each community is different in spirituality and in teachings of how we get up and how we prepare ourselves. In leadership, there are those born into it and those trained to be one. In spirituality, I must go back to a beautiful, beautiful, precious Siem. And that was late Rose James, who I had the opportunity to walk with her around archaeology in that field as I was trained to be doing burial recoveries. And she was there with us and her family to understand the importance of connecting with her and Auntie Ellen. So many precious things that we got to regain. Those who were chosen, those who were born into it, and disciplined to carry these teachings and to continually to bring it forward. I believe back in the day of, when there were longhouses within each community, it was oral teachings, never written, ever. Today, we are fortunate enough to be able to put it into a CD where we're listening to elders talk about a story and what that story means. And what a song means, a sacred song, a prayer song. And able to tell an individual why we pray, the tiwiyat, the hacha, and why to clear the path as we move forward, to embrace the energy as we move forward. And this is all around education. It could be the higher education within the universities, or it could be in the elementary level, where the younger ones are continually getting it every day. And each community has a process of bringing that forward. Through now, look at us, we're doing it on Zoom. And that's powerful. Where you have a beautiful background of a longhouse, where people gather. And that's how it was back in the old days. Gathering, teaching, learning from a speaker on the floor, one voice, and we as a witnesser, witnessing the event. That's a different type of education.
Auntie, thanks for reminding us that those teachings have been here forever, and it's been through the persistence and courage of many of our ancestors that they've been maintained and brought through what the Indian Act has imposed, so that we're the beneficiaries of those today. I raise my hands to all of the aunties and the knowledge keepers who are guiding us in the school district in our efforts to try to be different. I'm so pleased that we have language teachers in our schools that are from our nations, that are certified language teachers. The impact that has on all of us, our adults, our staff, all of our children in our community has been amazing. I'm going to ask our superintendent to talk about that path of Syeyutsus that the district is on, and how we're trying to walk in a different way with those teachings. So, Scott.
Asiem na Syeyya, Siem Solquen, Asha Siem, Ignative, Anthropos Scott Saywell, Tanitsanet, Duncan BC, Eatson Manaak, Robert Saywell, e Geraldine Manson, Edmonton, Alberta, Isepka Kwanzala Skakit, Atanaquayo, Titsalatas Nanemok Mustimok, Niha Kwashuk, Tamak Atanaquayo, Isap, Awith Siem. Good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Saywell. I was born in Duncan, BC, home of the Cowichan tribes, and the child of Robert Saywell and Geraldine Manson from Edmonton, Alberta. Thanks everyone for gathering here today. We give our highest gratitude and appreciation to the people of Nanaimo, which is the territory I'm on right now and I reside on. And thank you, respected ones. Thank you, Lawrence, for starting us off in a good way with your song. Much appreciated. Thanks, Stephanie and Ted and all the other panel members, and a special thanks to Bob Joseph for his words, and thank you for being with us today. I broke my collarbone a couple days ago, and so I'm at home in this cast. So if I'm wincing a little bit, it's because I'm wimpy and I'm on the mend. So it's a real pleasure to be with you guys today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what Syeyutsus means to us in the school district, and a little bit about maybe my personal journey and how that affects what we're doing in the school district. So I think Ted thought it was time to hear from a straight, white, able-bodied male and superintendent of a system that for Indigenous people hasn't been a positive experience. That would be an understatement. In fact, a tool of destruction and cultural genocide. And so, I've been on this sort of personal learning journey for some time to understanding culture and history and plight of Indigenous people. And it's kind of an auspicious meeting we're having today because there's so much happening, in the protests down in the excited states of America, which is where Ron is at. And I'm not sure you can even get out of there yet, Ron, but and the Black Lives Matter and all that's happening in Canada around the world with that issue. Chantel Moore, an Indigenous woman shot by police in Edmundston, New Brunswick. And I don't know if people saw that Nunavut man hit by a police cruiser a few days ago as well. And and COVID-19, it's a really interesting time to be talking about, and we're here, living in a country, essentially built on stolen land. And so, my story is a similar story to people my age, non-Indigenous. I was born in Duncan, BC, as I mentioned, in the 1960s. My story that I was told about Indigenous people was one of being lesser than. I was fearful of the Indigenous people in my neighborhood. They had gangs and stuff, right? They had this tribe, Cowichan tribes, and I was fearful of them. I grew up, Silver Bridge in Duncan, playing a game that most people will know my age and younger, counting Indians on the bridge of Silver Bridge. We would drive up to the bridge and we would all have a guess. And what a terrible sort of indoctrination. And so, if you're my age, again, we were brought up in a time where school systems did not share the true history and culture of Indigenous people. So what do you do about that? Well, you have a couple choices. You can do nothing. You can say that is, I wasn't there. I wasn't at fault. I'm not racist. I won't be responsible for what my parents or grandparents did. You can act the role of what Paulette Reagan in her book, name will come to me in a second, but she talks about being the perfect stranger. And so it's not your fault you weren't there. And Unsettling the Settler Within is Paulette Reagan's book, a very meaningful book to me. And so you have to find your own truth. And that, if you're my age, that has to be intentional. And so there's a couple things you can do if you're my age, non-Indigenous, and you haven't been told the true stories, that you need to take inventory. You have to yes, you have to ask yourself what your role is, what you've done or haven't done, what you need to do, and then you take action. So my action is simple, really. I read a lot. And so through my journey of reading and there's milestones in my education with lots of people that I've met along the way. People on this panel, the knowledge keepers, part of the Syeyutsus framework, have influenced me in a great deal. Some great books. Bob Joseph's 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer. Monique Gray Smith, Thomas King. Anything by Thomas King is good. I read a book recently called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which seems to be getting a lot of focus these days. And if you want to learn about what it is to be white and really look deep inside and understand your own privilege and unconscious bias and face those things, that's a pretty good book as well. All kinds of courses online. You can take Reconciliation Through Indigenous Education at UBC, Indigenous Canada at the University of Alberta. These are all free, what they call MOOCs, massive open online content. You can take the course for nothing. If you want to get the credit, you just pay after you take the course. And it's a great way to learn. I mentioned Ted and Stephanie. This is the kind of thing we're trying to do in Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools to educate people on the history and culture. Stephanie Johnson's position came directly out of our Syeyutsus policy. I wanted to call her number 57 for the Truth and Reconciliation, because that's the job that Stephanie does for us. She makes connections with our Indigenous partners and does things like this to educate all of us about the history. Laura Tate, I know she was on the line earlier, has been a huge impact on me. Laura Tate brought, who's one of our assistant superintendents, brought the idea of collective ownership. And, that one, it's a simple idea, but it really just has people asking what my responsibility. And I'll tell you a quick story. In 1996, I became a vice principal. And interestingly, that was the last Indian residential school closed in 1996. My first year as a vice principal. I remember being in, I remember it well, being in a principal's meeting. And the superintendent gets out there and talks to you and the assistant superintendent, and it's a parade of senior management people talking to you, sharing things and direction and so on. And then the district principal of the day of Aboriginal education got up. And when you're a vice principal suffering from imposter syndrome and thinking you're not worthy, and you're trying to take in all this information, when the district principal of Aboriginal education got up, I thought, okay, my mind can take a break. This person is leading the charge. She has this whole group of people working with her, EAs, language people, Ho'okiminum language teachers, and the like. And I thought, okay, well, they're well taken care of. And that was my thinking. And of course, that's wrong thinking, because, and that's what Laura Tate taught me a number of years ago, is that I have a really large role to play. Reconciliation is not for Indigenous people. Mm-hmm. Reconciliation is mine to figure out, right? We all have a role in this. And that's what you need to do. So lots of people along the way. I just want to maybe say about one other person that's profoundly influenced me, and that's only because, Bob, you talked about aunties. And Joan Brown, if you don't know Joan Brown, just by knowing Joan Brown makes you a better person. Joan Brown is the CAO of Nanaimo First Nation. And Joan Brown believes in her heart that we are all one. Can you imagine knowing a person who believes that in their heart, that we're all one? What an influence that has on people. I was at a volleyball game with Joan not so long ago at VIU, watching my daughter, and Joan was sitting by my wife, and Kim, my wife, says, as one of the girls, she's introducing Joan to various people, and she says about one of the girls, one of my daughter's friends, says, "We've claimed this one as one of our own." And Joan says, "I've claimed them all." And she means it.
Yeah.
Right? Joan believes in her heart of hearts that all flourishing is mutual. She believes that what we all went through, we've all lost something, right? Joan believes that the land is a sentient being. Can you imagine if we all treated the land as a sentient being, that it had something to offer in knowledge?
Mhm.
Can you imagine if Indigenous people led and we followed, where we'd be right now in history? That's kind of the stuff I'm thinking of. Our Syeyutsus policy, the idea of walking together is a powerful one. Indigenous people have walked in two worlds for a long time, and I really give so much credit to our trustees, because trustees in all school districts, they set the strategic direction, and every school district has goals. One goal we've had for a long time that I'm not sure any other school district has is around truth and reconciliation. It's a goal of ours. Out of that, so much good has developed. We have a school, Quam-Quam-Stiliqua, on reserve, a private school on reserve. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the difficulty that funders, the people in the ministry trying to fund such a school have with Indigenous Services Canada? There's a whole story right there. It's a challenge because nobody's thought of it yet, right? And so that is about self-determination. We are co-governing. We're not leading. We're not leading. This is a co-governance model. So our job is simple from senior management, and I have a team in learning services particularly that are mostly Indigenous. They understand that school districts need to make Indigenous education, history and culture, not for just Indigenous kids, but for all kids, a priority to improve the grad rates for all of our Indigenous kids, full stop. That's what we need to do. There's a great song Ted reminded me of from the late 1970s. It's a song by Joe Jackson. It's called "I'm the Man." And I'm a bit of a music fan. Well, you can see my guitars in the background. I can't play right now, but it's "I'm the Man." And there's a line in it that says, I can't always get through to you, so I'll get through to your son. I would add daughter to that. Yeah. But that's what we do in education, right? So our number 57 is in encouraging a community to understand the plight of Indigenous people, the history and culture, and we're working on the kids, right? That's our job, to indoctrinate them when they're young. Sounds kind of sinister, but that's what we do in education, and that's what we will continue to do. I'm gonna stop there. I could maybe say a little bit more, but I'll leave a little bit of room for questions. And Ron Poitras, who went from gang leader to university professor, which must be an interesting story. So, Huych'qa, I appreciate you all, and thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I'm absolutely sure that Joe Jackson's punk attitude would be thrilled that he was referenced in the reconciliation path in Canada. So thanks so much for that, Auntie Satasya, Geraldine, and Scott, and that reference to aunties guiding us has been beautiful.
Ted, could we just ask a couple of questions?
Sure, Steph. Let's do that. Pick a few out of there.
Perfect. I'd like to ask this one that Laura has put forward. I've struggled with my Indian status, knowing it is a creation out of the Indian Act, but I don't want to let it go as I fear us disappearing altogether. Bob, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, well, it was designed to, I'm trying to find nice words, but there's not really any, eliminate you and stop you from being an Indian. So it's kind of an interesting piece that way. I was doing some work with a community west coast near Victoria, and when I showed up there that evening, they said, you know, we want to protect all of our people, not just some of our people. It was kind of their opening sort of monologue to me, and so I made note of it, and then the conversation got deep and heavy, and we're diving into the nuts and bolts of self-government. And somebody said, we got to worry about all of our status Indians, worry about all of our community members. And I said, okay, I have to stop you, because when I came here tonight, you said you want to look after all your people. And what you're talking about is the Indian Act. And it was never designed to look after your people. It was actually designed to get rid of your people. And so you can't, you know, if you want to look after all of your people, what you're saying right now flies right in the face of, you know, of what you're trying to accomplish, looking after all of your people. So at some point, it is going to be totally okay to move away from the Indian Act. And we've seen many different treaty nations, self-governing nations move away from the Indian Act. The sky doesn't fall. It actually is a good place. We are searching for self-determination. I look at the East Coast right now, where there's a whole group of people that are fighting for status. And if I go back to my three main eras of history, they're fighting to get back onto the list to be status Indians. And I look at that honestly, and I think, wow, I mean, that's so, why are you trying to get back to something that was trying to get rid of you in the first place? And where really you want to be self-determining, that, you know, that's an inherent right for you to be who you are. And so I think we're gonna shift away from the Indian Act. I think it makes sense. From an educational perspective, I talked about the funding piece, you know, where there was not parity in the funding coming out of Indian Affairs for band-run schools. So I defend that system. Let's really, you know, when we're conversing with people, let's encourage people to move away from the Indian Act, to move to the self-determination, self-governance, self-reliance piece. Educational plays such a huge role in that. And so, yeah, it's kind of one of those conundrums. Don't fight to save the Indian Act. I mean, it's, as long as it's there, it's a detriment to everything that you're trying to accomplish. Education, sorry, Scott, it's not gonna be helpful, because it's just, they chronically underfund. Where I would rather, and this is just my own personal view, I'd rather see people paying taxes, but then getting the same amount of money as other students, so that, Scott, you can do a good job, that you're getting parity on the funding side to bring Aboriginal kids along. That would be a great thing. That'd be a great day in my book. And that's a world without the Indian Act. You know, so I hope that answers the question. Definitely, you know, right in the sweet spot of the transition. So we want to hang on to the past, but it really was designed to assimilate. We gotta be more forward looking. And it always, as Scott and certainly Ted, you've articulated, and the others as well, we're trying to hang on to that cultural identity. So this is for the 121 participants that are just sort of learning here today. Unlike other peoples, we haven't come here from anywhere. When we think about the Nisga'a Nation, they didn't come here from anywhere. You know, contrasted against, say, that Italian person who came from Italy, who knew that when they got here, it was going to be the land of opportunity, and they didn't have to worry about the Italian culture, land base, religion, political institutions, educational systems. That's all still somewhere else in the world. So that would be the big difference between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. In Canada, the Nisga'a Nation is in Canada and in Northwest British Columbia, and there is no other place in the world where it is. So we're trying really hard to hang on to our cultural identities. And I like, there's some other comments there too. We want to share. We think we can teach something through our oral history. And if we look at the Indian Act, you know, part of its rationalization was these poor people, they live short, brutish lives, and what we have to do is help them and make them feel better, right? And I can remember talking to my dad about this the first time, and I said, what do you say to people that say that? And he said, well, here's what I would say. And he said, you know, I would say, look, if you look at our culture, Kwak, I can't speak for Nanaimo or Snanaz or anybody else, but if you look at our culture, or actually not even ours, look at Kwantlen First Nation. The average Kwantlen First Nations person was working less than 9 weeks a year to get through Maslow's first 2 levels of the hierarchy of needs because of the fish cultures that they were. Less than 9 weeks a year, leaving the rest of the year, 40+ weeks a year, to let Lawrence pursue spiritual, cultural, higher level self-actualization goals. And we weren't paying taxes. So please tell us how what you have is better. We'd love to hear from you about how good things are where you are. So we definitely would have a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek about what we can share with people and the way we live and how we do things. And then also, if you are an educator, I think, Scott, you brought in a really neat concept there. The concept was how we present ourselves as we're working together, we're walking together. So I love the whole theme and the whole package. And one of the things that I see people that haven't had the experience and the contact of Ted and Ron and Geraldine and everybody else is they want to help. And I've had a lot of people come to me, Bob, I see the problem and I really want to help. And I'll say, good, don't say that. It just comes across so bad because that's what the federal government has been saying for over 130 years. Hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And no, you know what? I'm Bob and I've got lots to share and I've got lots to learn. I want to work with you, George, to find a way to get parity and graduation. I want to work with you to find out how we can get parity and funding and let's just get on this challenge together. So I think it's how you present yourself in your work with people. And so thanks. I hope that was a good answer. Not too long-winded, but pretty long-winded, though, I realize.
Yeah, like actually, Bob, and to Auntie and to Scott as well. One of the themes that Bob, that you just talked about was that assimilation and erasure, trying to get rid of identity, and that flows nicely into our third segment on our Talking with Syeyutsus in welcoming our Uncle Ron Poitra, currently sitting in Borrego Springs in Southern California, and working his way slowly back home. Ron, you saw in his biography, and as Scott mentioned, went from gang leader to university professor. He's also, with his, as a Métis elder, experienced the impacts of the Indian Act and the policies of the federal government to erase an identity of people. So I will turn the floor over to you, Uncle.
All right. Thank you, Ted. I just want to mention quickly that I agree 100% with Bob. I think the Indigenous people have such strong heritage and culture and history that they, being status or not status is, it's not an issue. I think getting rid of the status is probably a good thing because it doesn't matter, because the Indigenous people are so rich that it'll carry them through no matter what. And my argument's going to be, by the way, you can't assimilate Indigenous people. You might kill us, but you can't assimilate us. And that's going to be my theme. But in response to the question, Ted. But first of all, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank my fellow panel people here. I want to thank my Lawrence. Oh, I always have to thank Lawrence because Lawrence is so good. And I know Lawrence has been trying to teach me to sing, and my wife Peggy, and I'm pretty poor student, but I still try, Lawrence. I still try. So, and I'm working on it. And I want to thank my committee, Syeyutsus committee, because it's my family, and I really miss them. And I wish I was there with you right now, but I'm down here in the desert, which is pleasant enough. But I'm going to whine a little bit through the eyes of the Métis. So that's the first time I've done that with Syeyutsus committee. So I'm sorry, but it's going to be iron. I'm going to whine just a tiny bit, just a little bit, not a lot, just a tiny, tiny bit. So when you look at me right now, you're going to see three things. You're going to see an onion, which is me. You're going to see a 2-year-old brat, which is me. And you're going to see also a chameleon, which is me. Chameleon being an animal that can change colors, right? Okay, that's what you're going to see. So let me back into that. So that's what I am, all right? That's exactly who I am. So let's back into that a little bit. I want to talk, first of all, that the Métis are 2-year-old brats. And the reason we're 2-year-old brats is we lost our battle in Batoche, where my family was all there. And we lost our battle. And everything after that was hopeless and helpless. They murdered our leader. Our leader was both Stephanie Johnson and my cousin, incidentally. They murdered our leader. We went through this is the whining. We went through terrible times, homelessness, everything. And it still happens. In fact, in the health conditions of people in Canada, the Métis are at the lowest. So we're still going through a lot of troubles, and we still struggle a lot. So that's my whining. And that's the 2-year-old brat thing, because when our leader died, Riel, when he was murdered, he said in 100 years, the Métis will come back as a nation. And it took 100 years. And it was in the mid-90s that we came back as a nation. Well, relative to other Indigenous people, forming our committees and trying to be involved and struggling who we are and what we are and all that kind of stuff, we're new. And so we whine and complain a little bit. And Ted, if you have to put up with some of the stuff at different places, it's because we are new. And, you know, we're new on the block. And we're little brats in some way, and those people who've had 2-year-old children get an idea of what we are. So, you know, that just goes the way it is. And by the way, when Ted put the questions together, kind of guide us for this meeting, he did one historic, phenomenal thing. So we all refer to each other among ourselves, the Métis, oh, Métis so-and-so, Métis this. People outside of the Métis often refer to the Métis, and they think of Métis in a not such a positive way. And Ted said, when he wrote the question, how does a Métis man? You never hear that. Or a Métis woman. He wasn't talking about gender. How does a Métis man feel about what we've gone under and what's happened to us? That doesn't happen too often. That was a really nice. I went and kicked the box after that. I felt so, you know, my chest came out and I felt really, I felt empowered. I really did. Because I know what a lot of people think of the Métis, and for good and bad reasons, and you know, that's history, but I felt really good about that. Anyways, just a quick thing on some of my family. So Poitra. You may know a lot of Poitra are chiefs in Alberta and Saskatchewan, that they're full First Nation people. In fact, one of the Poitra as a chief has been fighting the tar pit issue, went to England, and he's pretty famous, a cousin of mine. A lot of the reserves in Saskatchewan are Poitra, primarily Poitra reserves. So, but I'm Métis. I'm not pretending to be otherwise, and I'm proud to be Métis. But we mingle, and we have mingled a lot. And my family has been powerful. Now, my dad ended up in a residential school, and he was there till grade 3, and he ran away and went home, and he was hidden. So his education ended at grade 3. Grade 3, just not fair. But anyhow, grade 3. But my dad was brilliant. He could speak any language. So it didn't affect him too much. And his education came from being at home with his family. My great-grandfather was one of the leaders in the Tosh War. And he was, of course, imprisoned afterward. His wife, who was First Nation, protected them and brought up the family, took care of everybody while he was in jail. My great-great-great-grandfather was on the border between Canada and the United States. He finally settled there. And he and his family have been involved in Wounded Knee episodes throughout history. So my role as a Métis and my role as part of my family as Indigenous First Nation it overlaps. And so we've been very supportive of each other. Anyhow, I'm old, okay? I was born in the 30s and grew up in Vancouver. My dad wanted to run away from Batoche and try to get a home and try to get something started, try to get a life. So I was brought up in Vancouver. I went to a parochial school. The teachers were all from Saskatchewan, so they all knew Poitras, and they all wanted to assimilate me as much as they could, and as hard as they could, and as desperate as they could. And so one day I would be Métis, and one day I would be a colonist. A chameleon. One color one day, one color the next day, all right? When I was Métis, I had a family and a gang. I had support there, but that wasn't going to get me anywhere. when I was a colonist. Now remember, I'm talking about growing up in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I was a second-class citizen. They knew that I was not a European. So, you know, I'd be the last hired and the first fired type of expression. And that's what happened to me. And there's no way I could really beat that. I could be in the gang, and it was probably much more supportive, and I learned a lot more. Lots of First Nation people were in it. Or I could be a second-class citizen. Now, you're a second-class citizen, you start playing a role. You say, okay, what do I say? Who am I? How do I respond? Do I talk too loud? Do I talk too little? My computer just went Zoom on me. I don't know if you see me even.
You're still with us, Uncle. Yep.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Refresh the page. There we go. If I'm still with you and you
Yep.
can see me, that's good. Okay, so I had to make a decision. Do I want to be a second-class person not knowing who I am, getting all sorts of personality problems, but knowing down deep in my heart, I'm Métis? So I put a smile on my face and I crossed over the border and went into the United States. Now I'm light-skinned. If I was dark-skinned, I would have never done that, I assure you. But I'm light-skinned. So I cross over the border, I go into the United States, start going to school. I find out, damn, I'm pretty smart. I always thought I was so stupid. I'm pretty smart. I can learn things, I can read things, I know things. And it became easy then to move ahead. Of course, all the time now, I'm not being a Métis, right? I'm not being Indigenous. So I have a family, my family comes along. My family is not Métis. My other family, my parents, my uncles, my aunts. Do we have problems? Yeah, we all have problems. Are we really messed up? Sort of messed up. But anyhow, so I have a family, and they then lately have embraced being Métis. And so my argument is, you might be able to color me a certain color on the surface, but I'm an onion down deep. And if you take a bite out of me, you're going to taste the onion. So there's no way that they can force me into assimilation. It just can't be done. And I don't think it can be done to anyone. I think we are who we are. By the way, do you still see me?
We do, yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't see myself, and which is the best part of the whole thing. But anyways, so I work my way up, and I do well, and my kids are all doing well. But they all want to grab onto the Métis thing. So they went to Saskatchewan with us, which is where we're all from originally. And that's where all Cree. And they got to meet things, meet my uncle, meet my cousins who's my age, same age as me, totally dark skin. And he's 82 and he's working as a caretaker in an apartment. I mean, there's no hope for him and there's no chance. When he quit drinking, that's all that was open to him. He's the smartest man and the nicest person I've ever met. And he's as Métis as you can make them. So whatever happened, he never lost that. So we held on to it, and all of us held on to it, and I just firmly believe what Bob said, that you can't take it. If the people have that cultural thing, they have it. So we might be little brats, and we might fight and kick a little bit because we're still finding our way. And my poor boss, Joy, for the Mid-Island Métis Nation, has to do most of the fighting and kicking, and I do most of the goodwill part, so I'm kind of happy with that relationship. Then the second question, so I think it's a joke trying to say we can be assimilated. They can kill us, but they can't, I think, assimilate it. And First Nation people absolutely cannot be assimilated. So I'd never worry about the status system. That has to be worked out, I understand, but I wouldn't worry about it. All right, so now I want to go to the second part of what was asked of me, and that was the TRCC as it relates to the Métis. And there is a volume about residential experience in volume 3, and so there was some recognition by the TRCC that the Métis did have some issues and some problems, but as it turns out, we haven't been really included in the reconciliation. The most I've seen is my experience in the Syeyutsus group, and they have been absolutely open, and I feel really, really powerful there and really good there. But I don't see too much of that across Canada for the Métis. In fact, when they had the opening ceremony, when the TCC finished their report, they never invited the Métis to it. So I don't see a lot of hope with that. And then I see a lot of new laws that come along. Bob has done the Indian Act thoroughly, but now we have this new one called speculation and tax vacancy, or speculation and vacancy tax. And it also then stifles the indigenous people. You can't move around as much. You're tied down. You can't cross borders. You can't be working. And it becomes very cumbersome for our people. And so I would recommend, as it relates to all laws, that there be something called an IIS for any new major BC law or Canadian law, that there's an IIS, an Indigenous Impact Statement. Every law should be reviewed by Indigenous people. So that's my little talk. I've cut it a little short here, but I hope that's good. And I'm trying to get back on to where I can see everyone. That won't do it.
Marseille, Ron, thank you so much for that personal path that you described for us and advice moving forward. I want to turn it back to Steph to see if there's any, and Karen to see if there's any questions that we want to jump to at this moment, and then I'll take it to a wrap up.
Oh, wonderful. Well, there's certainly a lot of attendees sending their gratitude and shout out to each of the panelists. I didn't see any questions percolate to the top, but if any of our attendees right now would like to put them in the chat, we could ask those questions for you. Just a lot of gratitude coming through. So give it a minute for anyone to ask your question.
And I always like to say to people, you know, if you're worried about how your question might sound, you can always throw a, what do you say to those people that say this, Bob, in front of your question? Just to try and create a safe space for those questions.
Thank you. I just got one that said, the session is so moving, so informative, thought-provoking, and enlightening. Thank you for your truth, your wisdom, and this session was a true gift. It's been amazing responsibility, amazing opportunity.
All right. Thanks, Stephanie. I want to say Huych'qa to all of our knowledge keepers for sharing your personal paths. I want to say Getla Kashla Nomad to our relative from the Cadwallader territory, Bob Joseph. I want to say Huych'qa to our amazing Syeyutsus Stephanie, and to Karen for making this event happen. And as many of us who are part of the cultural teachings in Indigenous communities, we know that it is smart women who make things operate. And any event that I've been at, that's what I've noticed, and it continues to happen here too. I want to say Huych'qa to all of our participants and guests who've come to join us today on this conversation. Redirect you for any questions to find Bob online and check out the blogs, newsletters, and the things that he does. I want to encourage you all too to stay on this path. Senator Sinclair and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada described this mountain. Senator Sinclair said, we've described the mountain, we're just asking you to do the climbing. And I will tell you that when we get closer to the top, the climb will be worth it. And the first steps that we've taken as a school district on this path of Syeyutsus have been greatly worth it. We've learned so much from our knowledge keepers here on how to better serve our families and children with lessons that have been on this territory since the beginning of time. So I want to say Huych'qa to you all, and have a great day.
Thank you. I'm going to end the session now.
Thanks, Steph.